Debbie Reynolds named the 9 racist stars nobody in old Hollywood dared to confront. For almost 70 years, Debbie Reynolds was inside the machine. From 1948 to 2016, she lived and worked at the center of Hollywood. From the golden age of the studio system through the digital era, she was discovered at 16 at the Miss Burbank pageant. She starred in Singing in the Rain at 19 with no dance training, later calling it and childbirth the 2 hardest things she ever did. She earned an Academy Award nomination for the Unsinkable Molly Brown. She scored a #1 hit with Tammy. She headlined Las Vegas showrooms for decades. And she survived what the industry threw at every woman who dared to stay standing. Her husband, Eddie Fisher, left her for Elizabeth Taylor while she was pregnant with their second child. In the biggest public scandal of the 1950s, Hollywood watched to see if it would destroy her. It did not. Her second husband gambled away her entire fortune. She rebuilt from nothing. Her third husband betrayed her financially. She survived again. She collected over 4,000 Hollywood costumes and spent decades begging the Academy to help her build a museum to preserve the industry's history. They refused 5 times. She was present the night Montgomery Clift had his devastating car crash. She helped closeted actors hide their sexuality when exposure would have ended their careers. And she was the mother of Carrie Fisher, who inherited her refusal to stay quiet. Reynolds wrote 3 memoirs: Debbie, My Life in 1988, Unsinkable in 2013, and Make 'em Laugh in 2015. In those books, she told stories about Ava Gardner, Clark Gable, Frank Sinatra, Gene Kelly, and dozens more that never reached the tabloids. She was described as frank, forthright, and a woman with clear-eyed memories who saw through every mask Hollywood ever constructed. They called her cute. They called her America's sweetheart. They thought the girl from El Paso who wore dungarees and never learned to dance was somebody they could control. They were wrong because Debbie Reynolds outlasted them all. And in 3 memoirs, she named the names nobody in old Hollywood dared to confront. Number 9, Fred Astaire. When 19-year-old Debbie Reynolds was being brutalized by Gene Kelly during the filming of Singing in the Rain, criticized constantly, given no encouragement, worked until her feet bled, she hid under a piano and sobbed. Fred Astaire found her. He reached down and said, "Now who is that?" He comforted her, told her not to quit, and invited her to watch him rehearse, something nobody was allowed to do. He showed her that even the greats found it hard to be excellent. Reynolds called him the sweetest man other than Jimmy Stewart. Astaire saved her career in its most vulnerable moment. But the man who showed such kindness to a crying teenager had already put something on screen that no amount of kindness could undo. In the 1936 film Swing Time, Fred Astaire performed the Bojangles of Harlem number in full blackface. The sequence opened with giant shoe soles arranged to look like a blackface with exaggerated red lips. The number was framed as a tribute to tap dancer Bill Bojangles Robinson, but it was built on minstrel caricature. Astaire grinned throughout, used exaggerated hand movements, and danced in a style deliberately different from his own, performing an anonymous black character for white audiences. Robinson himself, the man being honored, was still being denied equal billing in his own films and forced into separate facilities. Astaire was free to wear Robinson's identity as a costume and wash it off at the end of the day, and the cover-up was built into the praise. The number is still celebrated as one of Astaire's most rhythmically imaginative solos. Critics separated the artistry from the blackface and called it a complicated tribute rather than what it was. Astaire reportedly never performed in blackface again after learning it was offensive, but there was no public statement and no apology. His reputation as the greatest dancer in film history shielded the performance from real scrutiny. Hollywood decided the dancing was too beautiful to call racist. Astaire performed in blackface and Hollywood called it art. But the next name performed in blackface multiple times. As a child under the direction of the most powerful studio in Hollywood, the same studio that controlled Debbie Reynolds. Number 8, Judy Garland. Reynolds personally collected and preserved Judy Garland's ruby slippers from The Wizard of Oz for decades. They were the crown jewels of her memorabilia collection. Both were MGM products, young women molded and controlled by the studio system. Reynolds watched Garland's tragic art from America's beloved Dorothy to a woman destroyed by the pills, the exploitation, and the cruelty of the machine that made her. Reynolds understood Garland's story because MGM did the same thing to her, just differently. But before Garland became the tragic icon the world mourned, she was a teenager in blackface. In Everybody Sing in 1938, Garland performed in blackface at 15 years old. In Babes in Arms in 1939, she appeared in blackface again, alongside Mickey Rooney in a full minstrel show number. These were not hidden moments. They were featured musical numbers in major MGM productions. Garland was a child following orders for a studio system that treated blackface as standard entertainment. MGM put a teenage girl in blackface and sold it as wholesome family fun. And the cover-up was powered by sympathy. Garland's tragic life story, the addiction, the exploitation, the early death. Her status as a gay icon generated so much compassion that the blackface performances were erased from her legacy. Nobody wanted to tarnish the memory of Dorothy, the girl who sang Over the Rainbow and represented innocence for generations. The blackface numbers exist in the films, but are treated as invisible, skipped in retrospectives, unmentioned in tributes, absent from the conversation about her legacy. The studio that put her in blackface was never held accountable, because the conversation was always about what MGM did to Garland, never what MGM made Garland do. Garland was a child who did what the studio told her, but the next name was No Child. She was one of the most powerful women in Hollywood, and she used that power to terrorize everyone beneath her, especially those who could not fight back. Number 7. Joan Crawford. Both Crawford and Reynolds were MGM stars. Reynolds arrived at the studio during Crawford's reign and witnessed the culture of fear she created. Joan Crawford was one of the most feared women in the history of Hollywood. Nobody dared cross her because she could destroy careers with a single phone call. Studio executives, directors, and fellow actors walked on eggshells around her. She was the woman nobody in old Hollywood confronted, and for good reason. Behind the glamour, Crawford enforced a racial hierarchy in her private life that was as rigid as anything the studio system produced. She was documented using racial slurs directed at black household staff. She demanded that black servants not make eye contact with her. She treated minority workers as invisible people who existed to serve and never to be acknowledged. Christina Crawford documented the racial hierarchies in the household in Mommy Dearest, a home where black staff were subjected to dehumanizing treatment while Crawford performed charity for the cameras. Her behavior was not ignorance. It was the deliberate enforcement of a racial caste system inside her own home, and Hollywood buried it under spectacle. After Mommy Dearest became a cultural phenomenon, the conversation focused entirely on the physical and emotional abuse. The wire hangers, the rage, the racism documented in the same accounts disappeared under the more sensational stories. Crawford remained celebrated as a feminist icon of self-made power, and the racial cruelty she inflicted on those beneath her has been erased from her legacy. Crawford terrorized the people in her home, but the next name terrorized an entire industry. He was the most powerful man in Hollywood for 2 decades, and he was Debbie Reynolds' boss. Number 6. Louis B. Mayer. Mayer ran MGM. He controlled Debbie Reynolds' career, decided which films she would make, which stars she would work with, and what image she would present to the world. When Mayer told Gene Kelly that Reynolds would be his leading lady in Singing in the Rain, Kelly stared at her and said, "What have you done before?" That was Mayer's power. He could put a teenager with no dance training opposite the greatest dancer in Hollywood, and nobody could refuse. Reynolds saw that absolute power up close every day, and she saw how it was used to build a system that kept black performers in subservient roles for decades. Lena Horne was the first black performer signed to a long-term MGM contract. Under Mayer's leadership, she was systematically excluded from films distributed in the South because Mayer allowed Southern theaters to dictate casting. Her scenes were deliberately filmed as standalone segments that could be cut from prints without affecting the storyline. Racism was literally built into the editing process. MGM under Mayer produced decades of films that reinforced racial stereotypes while refusing to cast black actors in dignified leading roles. He controlled which stories got told. Stories about black dignity never made the cut, and the cover-up was institutional. Mayer was celebrated as the founding father of MGM, the studio of more stars than there are in heaven. His name became synonymous with the golden age itself. The systemic racism he enforced was treated as simply the way things were, as if the most powerful man in the industry had no choice. Lena Horne's treatment remains a footnote in MGM's legacy rather than a defining feature. The magic is celebrated. The machinery of exclusion that made it possible is ignored. Mayer built the machine, but every machine needs enforcers, and the next name volunteered to be one when nobody asked him to. Number 5. Gary Cooper. Cooper and Reynolds were among the most beloved screen presences in American history. The strong, quiet American hero and America's sweetheart. They operated at the highest levels of the same industry across overlapping decades. Cooper was so respected that when he spoke, all of Hollywood listened. Nobody dared challenge him. And when the most powerful witch hunt in American entertainment history came calling, Cooper did not hide. He volunteered. Cooper was a co-founding member of the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, the organization that built and enforced the Hollywood blacklist. He appeared as a friendly witness before the House Un-American Activities Committee, lending his enormous star power to legitimize the investigation that destroyed hundreds of careers. His testimony was not coerced. Unlike many who were pressured or threatened, Cooper volunteered to cooperate. The alliance did not just target alleged communists. It enforced a system that destroyed anyone who challenged Hollywood's treatment of minorities, anyone who advocated for integrated casting, anyone who pushed for stories about racial justice. And the cover-up was his persona. The strong, silent type became his permanent shield. Cooper's quiet, dignified screen presence made people assume he was a decent man who stayed out of controversy. High Noon, the film where he plays a lone lawman standing up for justice, became the defining image of his legacy. The irony was never addressed. The man who played heroes standing alone against cowardice actively helped destroy innocent people's careers for the crime of believing in equality. His HUAC testimony and alliance membership were buried under his filmography, and Hollywood never asked him to reconcile the myth with the reality. Cooper volunteered, but the next name made enforcement his life's work. He did the dirty work while bigger names provided the public face, and he made sure nobody who challenged the system ever worked again. Number 4. Ward Bond. Bond appeared in over 200 films in the same Hollywood Reynolds inhabited. He was John Wayne's best friend and closest political ally. But while Wayne was the public face of Hollywood conservatism, Bond was the enforcer, the man who maintained the lists, made the phone calls, and personally confronted anyone who stepped out of line. Reynolds lived inside the system Bond policed, and everyone at every studio felt the fear he created. As a leader of the Motion Picture Alliance, Bond was the most aggressive enforcer of the Hollywood blacklist. He personally maintained lists of suspected subversives and pressured studios to fire them. He confronted actors, writers, and directors in public, demanding they prove their loyalty or face destruction. He used the blacklist as a weapon to maintain not just political conformity, but racial conformity. Anyone who advocated for civil rights, integrated casting, or racial justice was a target. While stars like Wayne made public statements, Bond operated through intimidation, making sure compliance was total and resistance was career suicide. And his invisibility became the ultimate cover-up. Bond died in 1960 and was largely forgotten, remembered only as a character actor and the star of Wagon Train. The blacklist's enforcement mechanism, the day-to-day terror, the phone calls, the confrontations, was erased from history while bigger names got the attention. Bond was the invisible hand that did the actual destroying. The careers he ended, the voices he silenced, the stories never told because of his enforcement. None of it bears his name. You cannot confront what you cannot see. Bond enforced the system from the shadows. But the next name did not need shadows. He was the most respected actor in Hollywood, a two-time Oscar winner whose reputation was so towering that nobody dared challenge him about anything. Not even the things they heard him say behind closed doors. Number 3. Spencer Tracy. Tracy was one of MGM's biggest stars throughout Reynolds' years at the studio. She knew him. She watched the reverence the entire industry held for him. 2 consecutive Academy Awards, a feat never matched. His decades-long affair with Katharine Hepburn was Hollywood's worst-kept secret, but nobody spoke about it publicly because Spencer Tracy was untouchable. If the industry would not confront him about an affair everyone knew about, they certainly would not confront him about what he said when he was drinking. Tracy's alcoholism was legendary. He disappeared on benders, shut down productions, and was known to become hostile when intoxicated. Among Hollywood insiders, he was known for using racial slurs in private during these episodes. Colleagues who heard the language never spoke publicly because challenging Tracy was career suicide. His talent and his temper created a force field that deflected all scrutiny. The racism was not a secret in industry circles. It was simply something nobody was willing to address because the cost was too high, and the cover-up was his image. Tracy's legacy as the noble everyman, the priest in Boys Town, the judge in Judgment at Nuremberg, the father figure in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, was so powerful that his private behavior was completely shielded. His drinking was treated as a charming flaw of a tortured genius. His racism never appeared in a single biography during his lifetime. The ultimate irony is that his final film was Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, a film about racial tolerance, and it became the defining image of his legacy, while his private language told a completely different story. Tracy's talent made him untouchable, but the next name had something even more powerful than talent. He had moral authority. He marched with Martin Luther King Jr., and then he spent his final decades dismantling everything he once stood for. Number 2. Charlton Heston. Reynolds watched Heston transform over the decades. He played Moses. He played Ben-Hur, the most morally righteous characters in cinema history. And in 1963, he marched alongside Martin Luther King Jr. at the March on Washington, establishing moral credentials that would shield him for the rest of his life. But Reynolds, who spent her career watching Hollywood figures reveal their true selves, witnessed one of the most dramatic public transformations in entertainment history. By the 1990s, Heston became the president of the NRA and the face of a political movement whose policies disproportionately impacted Black communities. He delivered a 1999 speech at Harvard attacking affirmative action, cultural diversity programs, and political correctness. He told a Free Congress Foundation audience that white pride was under attack. He delivered the infamous "From my cold, dead hands" speech. The man who marched for civil rights spent his final decades providing the most famous face in entertainment to movements working to roll back those same rights. And the cover-up was a single photograph. The 1963 March image was weaponized by defenders every time Heston's later positions were challenged. He marched with King became the automatic response, as if one act of conscience immunized a person from accountability for everything that followed. Hollywood continued celebrating him as a civil rights pioneer, even as his positions moved further from what he once stood for. Heston used a photograph as a shield, but the number one name does not need a photograph. He has the single most influential film in American history. And Debbie Reynolds spent decades preserving his legacy while knowing the truth about what it represented. Number 1. Clark Gable. Reynolds wrote about Gable in her memoirs. She collected and preserved memorabilia from his career for her Hollywood museum. She held the physical artifacts of his legacy in her hands. Reynolds, the woman who dedicated her life to preserving Hollywood's past, had to reconcile the most celebrated leading man in film history with the most damaging piece of racial mythology American cinema ever produced, because Clark Gable was the face of Gone with the Wind. Gone with the Wind premiered in 1939 and presented slavery as a gracious Southern institution where enslaved people were happy, loyal, and devoted to their white masters. Mammy, played by Hattie McDaniel, was the ultimate stereotype, the devoted Black servant whose entire existence revolved around her white mistress. The film romanticized the Confederacy, portrayed Reconstruction as a disaster, and sold a fantasy version of slavery to hundreds of millions of people worldwide. Adjusted for inflation, it remains the highest-grossing film in history, meaning more people absorbed its plantation mythology than any other film ever made. At the Atlanta premiere, the entire Black cast, including McDaniel, was banned from attending because Georgia's Jim Crow laws forbade integrated gatherings. Gable reportedly threatened to boycott in protest, but was talked out of it by the studio. He went anyway. When McDaniel won the Oscar, the first Black person to ever win, she was seated at a segregated table at the back of the ceremony. Gable sat in the front, while the woman who won an Academy Award for his film sat alone in the back of the room. And the cover-up is the biggest in cinema history. Gone with the Wind has been protected as America's greatest film for over 85 years. It was re-released repeatedly, celebrated on every anniversary, treated as untouchable. The plantation mythology it sold has shaped how hundreds of millions of people understand American slavery. Not textbooks, not historians, but a Hollywood film. HBO Max briefly removed it in 2020 before adding a disclaimer acknowledging the problem while keeping the product available. Gable was the face. He was Rhett Butler. He made the mythology charming and desirable. He made audiences fall in love with the antebellum South. And that mythology has done more damage to how America understands its own history than any other piece of entertainment ever created. They called her cute. They called her America's sweetheart. They thought she was harmless. But Debbie Reynolds outlasted every name on this list. She survived the scandals, the betrayals, and the bankruptcies. She survived an industry that destroyed women far more powerful than she was supposed to be. And in 3 memoirs, she told the truth because by then, there was nothing left Hollywood could take from her. These 9 stars were protected by the most powerful system ever built. Their racism was hidden behind beloved musicals, Oscars, charitable images, moral authority, and the greatest film ever made. But Reynolds understood what the system never wanted anyone to know. You can bury the truth for decades, but you cannot bury it forever. And now you have seen the names nobody in old Hollywood dared to confront until one unsinkable woman finally did. If this video opened your eyes, like and share to support the channel and subscribe for more untold stories from old Hollywood.